And let us begin with drawing in together a deep breath through your nose to a count of 3. And hold it. And gently release. Sit in your stillness and continue to breathe. Again, drawing in breath to a count of 3. And hold. And gently release. And now just breathing on your own for a moment, sitting in your stillness. Continuing to breathe. And let's take one last big breath. And as you do, stretch your arms up. Hold it and release. Thank you for joining me in that brief grounding practice. Now I would like to present CFA's interruption practice statement. As part of our continuing commitment to racial justice work, when we experience examples of racial narratives, racism, or whiteness in our meetings, or as we conduct our business, we will speak up. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention. We will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. Further, as we engage interruptions, we will take an intersectional approach reflecting the fact white supremacy and racism operate in tandem with interlocking systems of oppression, of colonialism, class, cis-heteropatriarchy, and ableism. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in the service of ending the system of racial oppression. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this session, Ariana Brown. Ariana Brown is a queer Black Mexican-American poet from the south side of San Antonio, Texas, now based in Houston, Texas. She is author of the poetry collections We Are Owed in 2021 and Sana Sana in 2020. Ariana's work investigates queer Black personhood in Mexican-American spaces, Black relationality and girlhood, loneliness and care. Her debut poetry EP, Let Us Be Enough, is available on Bandcamp. She holds a BA in African Diaspora Studies and Mexican-American Studies from UT Austin, an MFA in poetry from University of Pittsburgh, and is currently pursuing an MLS in library and information sciences from University of North Texas. Ariana is a 2014 National Collegiate Poetry Slam champion and owes much of her practice to Black performance communities led by Black women poets from the South. She's been writing, performing, and teaching poetry for over 10 years, and you can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Ariana the Poet. Ariana, such a pleasure to have you here. I do some poetry too, and I'm just so excited for this. And my daughter, who also does poetry, is lurking in the background. We fell in love with you when we saw one of your performances on webinars. So with no further ado, I'm going to shut my mouth and hand over the mic. Sister, take the mic.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for grounding us in the space and for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be connected to another poet, too. I am so thrilled to have been invited to speak at this equity conference. As Sharon mentioned, I am a poet, I'm a writer and a teacher of creative writing, but my foundational degrees are in ethnic studies. And that's really where my heart is. That informs a lot of my writing and my teaching practice. And it also informs the topics that I write about in my poetry. I am very much someone who is deeply interested in history, and I write a lot about my life and my childhood growing up in Texas, the early racialization I experienced, the anti-Blackness in Mexican American communities in Texas. But one of the things that is really crucial to me about my writing is that I didn't want to only explore my personal experience. I felt it was crucial to be able to tie the things that I experienced to history so that I could have an origin point to be able to understand more of my context. That also helped me build community and relations with other folks who share similar conditions. And so I firmly believe that art is a crucial place where we can begin to imagine what liberation can look like for all of us. That's not to say that art has all of the answers, but I think it's a place we can go to explore what some of those possibilities might be. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about mostly poems from my first full-length poetry collection, We Are Owed. I will share some poems with you. I will talk to you about the ideas that are informing my writing practice. And when we move to the end of the talk, I have prepared a few sort of writing prompts for you. And if you're not a creative writer, that's fine. They're more in line with the themes of the talk. And then we can move into a Q&A portion. So I do encourage you to, if you have a journal, that you like to write in, or if you are someone who takes notes on a computer, I do recommend maybe just sitting with some of the themes or the ideas that really stick out to you, so we can have a conversation at the end of this. And if at any point a question comes to you, I encourage you to use the Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom screen and submit a question. And when we get to the end of the talk, I will answer as many of them as I can. Reflections are also welcome. Okay, I'm going to be going back and forth between showing you my face and looking at some slides, and we will watch a video together during the talk. I'll talk for about half an hour, and then we can get into the prompts and into the conversation. And I did forget to mention it, but I did want to say thank you so much to all of the event organizers, the interpreters, the captioners, everyone involved in putting this event together. Your work is much appreciated. Okay, I'm going to start with a poem from my book, We Are Owed. And here we go. So this is the title of my talk, We Are Owed, Language and Liberation. This is the first poem that comes in the book. We need new origins. Countries are killing everyone I love. From my cousin's lips, a wish for my safety. From my curandera's hands, rituals for healing. I simmered rosemary and drank its tea, grew my hair thick as a plague, spoke poems till my throat blistered and waned, and still could not curse colonizers enough to undo their work. No one I know has enough money to live, yet asks if I've eaten. Before days end, we feed each other our Blackness, grow full from offering, our many tongues, studies, compassion, our wilderness and names. We run the length of country, reddening our feet, come to our own ends to face ourselves. What will we leave in our wake? Who we are now is our responsibility, our empty pockets, our humility or shame. Culture alone will not save us. Who are you without your country? What would you give? Would you fight for those you don't love, to whom you are indebted? When you think of the ethnic or cultural group you belong to, do you feel a sense of pride? Why? Why is it important for you to feel proud of your culture or ethnicity? Sometimes I wonder if we are doing ourselves and each other a disservice by focusing so much on pride instead of liberation. I say all the time that I'm proud to be Black. For me, that pride is rooted in a deep understanding of history, particularly the Black Power era of the late 1960s and early 1970s, in which Black activists and young people collectively and publicly embraced Blackness, its natural textures, as beautiful. But this public celebration of Blackness wasn't simply aesthetic. It was tied to the political goals of the time, the anti-war sentiment during the height of the US war against Vietnam, the growing political insurgency among Black radicals and communists committed to global liberation movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as the fight for Black liberation in the US. Black activists of the time saw all of these struggles as relational. They were fighting imperialism in its many forms. I am proud to be Black, which is to say, I place myself in the legacy of Black radical thought that continues to demand better conditions for Black life, which is to say, I am against imperialism and anti-Blackness in its many forms, in whatever country or culture it invades and tries to take over, which is to say, I am skeptical of so many things, including many of the ways we speak about being Mexican or Mexican American. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, where I was taught to be very proud of being Mexican American, to correct other people's Spanish pronunciations, to show off my skill at eating spicy food, to compete with others to see who could be the most authentically Mexican, to shame those who did not measure up, who were not good enough representations of the people we claimed to be. The people I grew up with think of themselves as very different from white Americans, even if at times they have the same skin color or beliefs. Their Mexicanness, their Spanish fluency, their class or immigration status, their claim to an indigenous past is supposedly what sets them apart. And yet, there is no talk among them about how white supremacy operates in Mexico or how they benefit from it. We've spent so much time building a definition of what it means to be Mexican American and drawing pride from that definition that we don't question the existence of Mexico as a nation state. The violences Mexico commits against Indigenous and Black peoples, against Central American and Haitian migrants, we overlook, we misremember, we do not study Mexico's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. We think of Mexico as a country full of people of color, as though it was not also founded by European colonizers, as though their white and mestizo descendants are not still the ruling class there. We are so attached to our pride, to speaking beautifully flawless Spanish, that we do not acknowledge Spanish is also a colonial language forced upon Afro-Indigenous peoples all across Latin America and the Caribbean. I don't know about you, but I am not proud of any of that. When I say culture alone will not save us, I mean that me being proud of being Mexican will not lead any of us to liberation. I'm asking you to consider who you are outside of your relationship to a nation state, an imperial power. And so I turn to history for an example. I'm about to show you a YouTube video written, illustrated, and produced by David Heredia. The video is about an African man named Gaspar Yanga, who I've written many poems about. But before I share any of these poems, I'm going to let this short video give you a brief introduction to who Gaspar Yanga is. All right, thank you all for watching that video with me. And if anyone is interested in returning to it, I'm going to paste the link in the chat, because there are not a lot of resources in English that explain who Gaspar Yanga was. And now if we think about the context of this video, the folks that are typically taught in the US in regards to slavery and sort of freedom fighters, people who are liberating others, we hear a lot about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. Gaspar Yanga was leading people to freedom decades before those folks that we already know. He founded the first free African settlement in the Americas. And I'd be willing to bet that for most of you, this is maybe your first time hearing about him, which is why I show this video to as many people as I can. I first saw this video in 2016. I have a degree in Mexican American Studies and African Diaspora Studies. And yet, prior to seeing this video, I had never heard of Yanga. You would think that the person to create the first free African settlement in the Americas centuries before the Haitian Revolution would be worth studying. And for me personally, as a Black Mexican American, I have felt very lonely in Mexican American spaces because of the anti-Blackness I experienced there. For a long time, I had a deep desire to belong to Mexicanness, to be like everyone else on my mom's side of the family who I grew up with. It wasn't until recently when I started to question Mexican pride, when I started to learn about Mexico's violent relationship to Black people throughout history, that I started to ask myself, why do I want to belong to Mexicanness if that identity is forged through violence? How can I explore my relationship to other Black people who are in the same spaces as me, even if we're the only Black people there, even if that other person is not alive today, but is a historical figure whose life and achievements exist in relation to my own? And what can I learn from them about how to navigate those spaces? It is a little disappointing to have to rely on YouTube and not textbooks or teachers to learn your history because it's been kept from you, because there's so little that's been preserved. But I feel very grateful now to know about Yanga, to write poems to him, to ask him questions, to wonder what it would have been like to know him in the material world. Aside from this statue designed several centuries after his death, as far as I know, there are no surviving images of him. Why I want to know what Yanga looked like. If I had a photograph of Yanga, if one arrived in the mail from a friendly but weary postman in a long, thick envelope sealed with spit that was spat between the gap in two clean teeth, because I think of Yanga as having a gap between his teeth. Not sure why, just seems like it makes sense. Not a humongous gap, but a small one, a thin space between two yellow bones at the front of his mouth, the crack in a bell that makes the song sweeter. And when I speak about songs, I am always speaking about freedom. A gap like that, where everything goes black for a minute, and then the lights come on. And somehow what you are seeing is more beautiful because of the interruption, because the interruption becomes part of the thing itself. And suddenly you can't imagine the two teeth, wide and high at the top of the mouth like sails, having ever existed without a dark spell in between them, marker of an absence, skinny Black pillar, little room holding everything I have lost since Yanga's escape, since the sieges on land and by foot, the open door to 4 centuries of running and a fistful of secret languages I only speak in my dreams. If I looked at the photograph of Yanga and found all that, a litany of things thieved from my contemporary memory, and Yanga had sealed the envelope with spit and a lick of aloe vera, then I'd frame the photograph and hang it in the center of my home. So every time I left, before locking the door, I'd check for Yanga, grinning at me with a gaze 4 centuries long, Black streak in his smile, the 2 large teeth shining like sugar. I have one more Yanga poem to share. This one is in the form of a letter addressed to him. Yanga, did you really agree to turn in runaways in exchange for freedom, your people's freedom? Were you a patriarch? I have no room to judge, no experience to understand yours exactly. I still love you. I just want to know. Did you have children, a wife, a gender, a husband, or a few? In my knowledge of you, what has been imposed, invented? Yanga, I have been thinking about birth. Who was your mother? How many people loved and raised you? What did you call yourself? How many people loved and raised you? Was it you that birthed the people, or your wife? Were you a man or something freer? I've been thinking about birth as the place we begin, but I want to begin with you. I think I do. What language did you speak, and who taught it to you? Did you like chocolate with hot peppers, like Quince Duncan said? Or the way loving someone means you will always remember them, even if you forget their face? Teach me to be a person without a nation on the other side of enslavement. I will write to you always. Someone we cannot picture is writing to us now, asking for assistance. They are on the brink of an escape neither you nor I could see. They are ours, and the way we are each other's, and the way you were your people's. And they are bringing all of us with them into the forever universe where we are always free. I stopped saying I could never have imagined, because when I met you, it stopped being true. I don't know enough details about Yanga to write biographical poems about him. Everything I know about him is in that 3-minute video that we watched together. So I decided when I was writing We Are Owed that I didn't want to come off as an expert. I'm just curious. I'm interested in Yanga's life, in his grand achievements toward liberation for him and his people, as well as the little things about him, what he liked to eat, how he saw himself. I think it's really important when we study Black people, particularly people who were enslaved, that we allow them their full humanity. In the poems for my book, I didn't want to invoke Gaspar Yanga and ask him to do more work. He did so much with his life already. I wanted to honor him, to build a genuine relationship with him and his memory, and to give these poems as offering. There is no way for me to understand myself as a Black person with a relationship to Mexico without understanding and honoring Gaspar Yanga, an African person who was not Mexican, who was kidnapped and enslaved by Spaniards and had an adversarial relationship with the Mexican state, and actively fought not only for his freedom, but his people's too. When I think about the kind of relationship I want to have with a country that exists because of slave labor and genocide, and that applies to the US and to Mexico, I look to Yanga's example. One of the books I came across when studying Yanga is a book of short stories by the Black Costa Rican writer Quince Duncan. In his book, A Message from Rosa, an African diaspora novel and short stories, he wrote a short story about Yanga, which I was very excited to find. The book is originally written in Spanish, but I was able to get my hands on an English translation, and I was so excited to get it in the mail because I wanted to see how a legendary, established Black Latin American writer like Quince Duncan was creating art about someone who I am extremely inspired by. And while I love the historical details Duncan included in the story, I was surprised by the role that gender played. Duncan describes Yanga's wife in very sexual terms and frequently describes the kind of sex they have. Yanga's wife is relegated to a background character who seems to only want to serve Yanga. And while I understand that Yanga was the ruler of his community, I felt uncomfortable reading Duncan's patriarchal vision of who Yanga was. Not because Duncan described Yanga and his wife as sexual beings, but because of the embracing of what I perceived to be cis-heteropatriarchy. Even in the stories we write about our liberators, we have a hard time imagining life outside of the confines dictated to us by the nation state. We assume people must identify with the gender we would have assigned them at birth. We assume people must be straight. Based on the studying I've done, I have no definitive way of knowing how Yanga understood his gender or genders, his sexuality, or his relationships to others. This is why questions appear in the letter I write to him, not definitive statements of who he was. Because I want to imagine that if someone is actively engaged in liberating Black people, there is also the possibility that the way they view gender and sexuality and self is beyond my comprehension, because it's beyond what the nation state could imagine for them. When I think of Yanga, I like to think he believed in freedom in all forms. Of course, no vision of freedom is complete without freedom for Black women and girls. There's a series of poems I wrote to honor the Black women and girls in my family. They are the people closest to me, who taught me how to be in the world. This next poem I'm going to share, I actually wrote for one of my younger cousins, who is pictured here. We were raised in a non-Black Mexican-American family, and the two of us are usually the only Black people at our family gatherings, so we stick together. My cousin is not fluent in Spanish, and so when our aunt brings out the Loteria game, which you might know as Mexican bingo, I always help my cousin play. She's super competitive and does not like to lose, so I try to help her out. This poem is for her. And you can see in the photo on the left that we're holding up our aunt's homemade Loteria boards. And so Loteria has these very colorful pictures, and each picture is named by the item or the person depicted in it. So it's basically the same rules as bingo. There's just more images and color in the game. So this poem is called Negrita, for my cousin. Playing Loteria, I teach you to match word and picture, and your eyes dry from the stare. We inhale the colors. Winking back at us, they taunt. They will never give us a name like theirs. Your golden hand hovers, a nervous onlooker, and I fear you offer your heart to this language. Run your tongue along its teeth, looking for light. I lean into your shoulder to stop the sun from leaking between us. You and I are not mirages. Neither are our ghosts. To survive here, mija, I work on the words, making a list of everything we are owed. I think a lot about what the world owes Black women and girls. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Loteria, which is why I described a little bit about what it's about and the pictures that are in it. But if you're not familiar with Loteria, or if you are, this is something that I think about a lot, actually, that one of the striking things about the game is that the only Black character pictured in the game is a Black man, El Negrito. Even the way he's referred to as the little Black man or the Black boy is derogatory. Depending on the way you say the word, people sometimes use it to mean the N-word in Spanish. And this is the only depiction of Blackness in the entire game. There are lots of other characters who are people in the game, but El Negrito is the only Black character. And the other people in the game, with the exception of the indigenous character, El Apache, the other people in the game are named by what they do. El Soldado is the soldier, El Mundo is Atlas, who's holding up the world, but El Negrito and El Apache are named by their racial characteristics. I know that this is a small example of anti-Blackness and misogynoir within Mexican and Mexican-American culture, but it is an insidious one. It is representative. The games we play at family functions, the songs we listen to, the stories we tell our children about who we are, all of these things inform our view of the world and of each other. They are also informed by white supremacy and cis-heteropatriarchy. Culture is not neutral. It is not something to be romanticized. And every time I sit down with my cousin to play Loteria and our family of mestizos who have such beautiful childhood memories of playing the game together on their homemade Loteria boards that they put together from old cereal and pizza boxes, I am jealous of the ease they have while playing the game. When my cousin and I look at the Loteria boards as we're playing, we are witnessing our own erasure. And to be clear, If the Loteria game suddenly started including Black female characters, it doesn't mean that white supremacy would stop existing in Mexico or in Mexican American spaces. I am not interested in the project of inclusion. I am interested, like Gaspar Yanga, in an adversarial relationship with the state. I use this story as an example of a moment when I began questioning the erasure of Blackness in Mexico and how the violences enacted against Afro-Mexicans, Afro-Indigenous people, and enslaved Africans is related to my own experiences of loneliness, isolation, and anti-Blackness. When I begin to explore the relationships I have with other Black people, I write about Yanga, and I also write about the Black women and girls in my life. Because my cousin loves to play Loteria so much, I thought it would be fun to describe her with all of the color and fun of a Loteria image, not because I'm invested in the game itself, and I want to highlight that, but because I know she enjoys it, and I wanted to center my love and care for her in honoring her interests. And so I have a poem in We Are Old that is called La Prima, which is kind of thinking of her as if she was a Loteria character. And so I describe her as La Negra que lleva la rosa de la flor, or the Black girl who wears the pink of the flower, because pink is her favorite color. Her almond-dipped hands steadying my blouse through the needle as it whirs, knees kissing carpet, hunched like a bright pink sky over the machine, silver-looped neck, fuchsia eyeglasses, and brows full as the outline of her afro. Dimpled and long-legged, when she calls my name, it slides between the gap in her teeth, bounces off the orange ball signed by WNBA heroines, and her glistening trophies applaud the mascara twirler who resides in this room with walls the color of a ballet slipper. When I wrote that poem, I wanted to celebrate my cousin. I wanted to give her her own moment, which I believe she deserves. She was really interested in fashion design for a long time and likes sewing, and was also an incredible basketball player who loves makeup. So in the poem, I wanted to include all of the details about a person you would need to know if you were going to paint them, but I didn't want her to be frozen or trapped in a still image like she would be if she was a Loteria card. I didn't want her to be frozen or still like she would be if she was like El Negrito, right? Without a backstory. So instead, I describe her in the act of sewing, to show that she is a living, full, three-dimensional being. And this is my way of honoring her. After I wrote this poem, I ended up writing 3 more about 3 other Black women in my family. One is my aunt, La Tia. One is my great-grandmother, La Bisabuela. And one is my mom's best friend, who I describe as La Angelita, because she was in the delivery room with my mother when I was born. I think of these women and my cousin as anchors in my life. I've spent a long time looking for community, and it's taken me a while to remember that there have always been Black women and girls shaping, protecting, and caring for my life, even before I arrived in the world. To honor them all, I wrote this final poem in the series called Loteria de la Negra. Now, there are many ways to play Loteria. My family likes to play for the pocito, which is the 4 squares in the middle. We also gamble when we play, so it's 50 cents per game per board, plus an additional 50 cents if you want to play for the pocito. And the money for the pocito goes into a separate pot. So if you win the pocito, you win all of the money in that pot. In this poem, I place all 4 Black women and girls alongside each other as if they were the 4 squares in the middle of the board. Again, not to endorse the game of Loteria, but to pull from my own life experiences, because this is my context, and use that context to honor the Black women and girls who have kept me alive all of these years. In the poem, I say, the women gather themselves, lineage whirling through each coil of my hair. I wished for a mother that looked like me, so I find las negras and give them names here. Language is so important. to be able to name yourself on your own terms. Black, Black is beautiful, to know what words to say that will connect you with another person, soy negra, to know what questions to ask, like what is patria, or what histories to study, what has been kept from me, to help you understand yourself or find your people. I work on the words because they make things clear to me. They help me contextualize my experiences within a larger history, and that makes me feel less alone. Words allow me to celebrate and honor others, and the specific language Black organizers and artists use gives me a foundation to understand the vision of liberation I will fight for alongside them. I have begun to study the lives and work of African, US Black American, Afro-Indigenous, and Afro-Caribbean artists, thinkers, and freedom fighters. I did not come to the ideas in this talk alone. I am indebted to the following people for teaching me through their art, their words, their scholarship, and their social media about the limits of patria, mexicanidad, and latinidad. I am indebted to Alan Pelaez Lopez, who teaches me to care for others better, even if I do not love them or know them well, that this too is a political ideology based in solidarity and an understanding of global oppression. I am indebted to Alan's poems, visual art, and scholarship on queerness and Blackness and Afro-Indigeneity in Mexico. I am indebted to Jessica Lene, an Afro-Cuban American writer from the South, who teaches me Spanish, Afro-Caribbean sensibilities, how to survive in this world as a Black woman taking care of other Black women, whose poetry and friendship informs and feeds my own. And I am indebted to Dash Harris and Javier Wallace, two Black Latin American thinkers and teachers and scholars who are so knowledgeable about Black Latin American history. They teach online classes about it and frequently share free information on their social media. And of course, I am indebted to the memory and life of Gaspar Yanga, the first liberator of the Americas. I am indebted to all these people and so many more for reminding me of the things Black people deserve, for the lives we have built in the face of colonial and neo-colonial nation states in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, for reminding me of everything we have resisted, failed at, learned from, and what we are working toward. In other words, what we are owed. This concludes my talk. I would like to move into the writing prompts just for a few minutes while we sort of collect our thoughts and process together. So go ahead and bring out whatever writing materials you have with you, whether that's a journal or maybe you have a Microsoft Word or Google Doc document open on your computer. I'm going to ask you a series of questions and give you a few minutes of just silent time to write and reflect, and then we'll move into questions. So the first question I have for you is, when you think of the ethnic or cultural group you belong to, do you feel a sense of pride, and why? So take a minute or two to write to this, and I'll stop you in a couple minutes. You're welcome to keep responding to that question if you are in the thick of it, but the following question is to consider the aspects of your ethnic or cultural group that you are not proud of and to describe them in detail. And then tell us, why are you not proud of those things? Take a few minutes. All right, moving on to the next question. There are only two more. The next question is, aside from your ethnic, cultural, or racial identity, who are you? Describe yourself. Take a couple minutes. Okay, and finally, the last question, which I think is the most important question. What are you willing to give up in regards to your relationship with nation states so that liberation can be achieved for all? Take a few minutes. All right, go ahead and come to a stopping point. We've got about 5 minutes left. And so if you have, I'd love to spend the next 5 minutes answering questions. And so I believe the chat is disabled, but if you have a question, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click the Q&A button, and you can type your question there, and I should be able to see all of them as they're coming in.
So we do have a question for you, Ariana. And let me just tell you that people really love the questions you posed for us. And I know those will cause a lot of reflection. Here's a question from anonymous attendee. We often only know that millions were enslaved in the transatlantic ocean and trans-India ocean slave trade. We often do not know individual subjects and their humanity. Is it going to take artistic and creative production to imagine and bring forward possibilities of who these people were in all their complex humanity?
That's a fantastic question. And thank you for reading that aloud, Sharon. I appreciate it. To answer your question, I think that that is one of the ways that we can begin to understand what these people might have been like, what their lives might have been like. I know that there is not historical record for everything, but whatever we can cull from the archives, we should. We should be in deep study with whatever records are available, even if they're limited. The writer and scholar Saidiya Hartman has this beautiful idea of I want to say it's a critical fabulation, which is this idea of basically doing exactly what you are describing. It's doing what I was doing in the poems about Yanga, which is sort of sitting with the history and really trying to consider what this individual's life might have been like, not in a romantic way, not in a two-dimensional way where the person is always a hero and doesn't have flaws or dislikes, right? But to actually think of them as an embodied being, because so often when we look to our heroes, the people we study, activists and organizers and freedom fighters, we put them on a pedestal and we forget that they were human beings. They had flaws, they had likes and dislikes and interests, and those things are just as important about them. It's really important for us to not flatten any individual's experience, and to not flatten our identities, right? Which is the other main thread in this talk, to be able to talk about the nuances, the complexities, the things we're not proud of, because it's going to take us dealing with those things too to be able to reach liberation, right? Or when we do arrive in that place of liberation and the world as we know it has ended and we're in a different world, we have to know who we are to each other outside of these fictional divisions that currently structure our world. So that's why I ask, who are you outside of your country, outside of your ethnic, cultural group? Who are you? You know, if white supremacy ended tomorrow, would you know yourself? Would you know who you are? Would you be able to relate to your neighbor? We have to be able to think about those things.
That is a deep question. We have another one for you. And I want to thank the anonymous person for that last question. That was really provocative. So from Sean Gordon, thank you for your talk. It was deeply moving. I have a question about your comment that you are not interested in inclusion, but in having an adversarial relationship to the state. I love that. As a literature teacher, I seek ways to illustrate how poetry and poetics can themselves take an adversarial relationship to the state. Would you mind offering thoughts about how your work does this? And thank you, Sean.
Sure. Yes, thank you for that question. I think that it is one of the things I think is important to acknowledge, especially for artists, is that art is hugely impactful for social movements, and also it is not enough to just be an artist, to simply just write poems. Me writing poems is not going to stop violence from happening. And so if I am a writer and these are topics I write about, I must also be actively engaged in whatever local movements are happening in my city, in my town. Most of my closest friends are organizers with Houston Mutual Aid, because I live here in Houston, Texas. And so, when we had the Texas freeze, a little while ago, they were on the ground, accepting donations on social media. They were making sure that they were using those money to send groceries and hand deliver groceries to people while the streets were covered in black ice and the city was basically shut down because of power outages. And so when I talk about sort of liberation, I don't just mean in an abstract way. I mean the actual tangible resources, sacrificing, sharing resources, thinking about what you have available to you and how you can create better conditions for the people in your community. That is also part of the work. If I just write poems about how I think about a liberated future, but I do nothing in my everyday life to enact that, I'm a liar. And so with my writing, it's part of the study. I want to talk about my conditions and sort of process the thinkers and scholars and activists and organizers that I've studied. But then I also want to practice that outside of the work too.
Clearly working in the Black feminist tradition.
Yes, very much.
Activism. I do not see another question. I think that we are supposed to be concluded. I rarely finish things on time myself, so it's a challenge. I just want to thank you so much. And is there anything you want to leave us with? I do have one thing, because I'll say a number of people I've been texting with are like, we should have her on our campus. Are you at all interested in teaching in the California State University maybe in ethnic studies or Black studies or women's studies?
You know what? I would love to teach something virtually. I traveled so much before the pandemic, and Houston is my final destination. So I'm not leaving here, but if I do college class visits, and I'd be happy to join into your classrooms or to do things more hands-on with your students. And I do also offer lesson plans for my work that are free and downloadable on my website for educators. So those are also available to you. And then to answer your last question, Sharon, if there's anything I wanted to leave you with, I wanted to answer that and just briefly respond to Kathy's question in the chat, which is, what is my ideal frame of an ethnic studies curriculum to do what we are owed? The last thing I will leave you with is that Black Studies is foundational. It was the first ethnic studies program that was developed, and it was gotten through force. And I think sometimes we forget that it is, all the other ethnic studies programs are crucial, but I think we forget that Black studies is the foundation. And so I didn't learn in Mexican American studies how to analyze power dynamics, how to develop a vocabulary for white supremacy. Black studies taught me that, and Black feminist theory took it further. And so we must continue to return to those scholars, because not all of those ideas are transportable into Latinx studies, into Asian American studies, because the conditions of Blackness are so specific and unique in the world. And we have to be able to talk about things critically, right, in order for us to move to that place of liberation. So please continue to study. That is the thing I will leave you with. Continue to study. And thank you so much for letting me have some time of yours today.
Thank you so much for helping us to advance our work on anti-Blackness. We really want to dive into all these things that we need to do to be better co-conspirators and to really build solidarity, but not at the risk of silencing anybody. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you, and thank you for your generous offer of your lesson plans. That's just huge. I wish you well.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you. Everybody take care.